So, as someone who speaks a lot to the public about science and ethics, I'm not sure I've ever spoken to a public audience where I have not gotten the playing God question. So I just preempt it in my talks now. Human beings have been playing God since we crawled out of the trees.
By examining these tenets across a diverse set of timely and complex issues, we'll seek answers to critical questions that define us, not just as a Jewish community, but also as humans in a constantly changing world. Our series engages panelists with varying and oftentimes opposing viewpoints as a means of bringing a deeper understanding and respect to the important issues with which we wrestle. Tonight, we present the question, is science replacing God? Are science and religion forever locked in conflict, or can they coexist? We will explore some of the most controversial breakthroughs in science and examine what happens as our ethical and religious institutions struggle to keep up with science's latest developments.
I'm sure you all know this statement by Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA in the astonishing hypothesis. He wrote, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are all in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So the question is he right? Or is there room for both God and scientific inquiry? And how do they relate? And so those are the kind of tiny little questions we're going to try to tackle tonight. And we have just the panel to do that. So why don't we jump right in? Let me ask you this. If you all could explain briefly how science has or has not affected your view of religion, or how religion, your religion or religion in general or faith, has affected your view of science. If you could just talk to us about that a little bit.
So, my father was a rabbi, and two of my brothers are rabbis. My daughter is in rabbinical school. I went to a yeshiva, which is an Orthodox Jewish day school, through 8th grade, and then to a Hebrew high school through 12th grade. So I was steeped in the brine of Judaism in a way that is kind of deep in my DNA. So I can't conceptualize the world outside of that socialization. So in that sense, my entire attitude towards science is somehow a reflection of that upbringing. But I've always been keenly interested in science, and I don't find those two postures and those two ways of seeing the world at all incompatible. And I think Judaism in particular has space for that. I'll tell you a very quick anecdote. I was, for long story how, I was at Carl Reiner's 90th birthday party. And my brother David, who's a rabbi, was giving the invocation. And he mentioned the word God. And the audience was filled with comedians, because it was Carl Reiner's 90th birthday. So one of them yelled out, "Too bad Carl's an atheist." And Carl, at 90 years old, jumped out of his chair. It was in a big auditorium, ran up onto the podium, threw his arm around my brother David, put his face in the mic, and he said, "I'm not an atheist. I'm a Jewish atheist. That's a different thing." And I think that's it in a nutshell. Judaism has that expansive capacity to allow a lot of different perspectives on these questions.
Well, let me jump in. I'm a plasma physicist, a workaday scientist at MIT, and yet my research field is associated with what are called plasmas, incredibly hot gas, ionized gases. And the whole mission of my research for more than 40 years was to explore whether or not we can make fusion energy, the energy source of the sun and stars, make that available on the human scale. So one aspect of the interaction between my faith and my science is that it is in part because of my faith, which leads me to care for humankind and for the earth and so forth, that led me to this field, and indeed has led many of my colleagues and collaborators in that field, many of whom are people of faith, and certainly people of deep spiritual commitment. The flip side, though, is I'm a Christian, and there's a big part of the Christian church that has come to a conclusion that there is some kind of tension or warfare even between science and their religious faith. That to me is very surprising, because actually modern science as we know it grew up in very much a religious environment. Many of its pioneers were deeply committed and spiritual Christians, and over the first few hundred years that remained true. Many of the people who did the early science in the 18th and 19th century were clerics of one sort or another. But it's become commonplace, I think, in the 20th and now the 21st century to think that there is some intrinsic warfare between science and faith. And my interest and concern is to examine that and to offer a different perspective, one which I think is truer to the history of science and to its reality.
So, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I should say that I'm not a person of formal faith, but I am a person of faith in people, and also in our capacity to use ourselves to do something good. And your question reminded me of a time when I was a graduate student in Bill Galbart's laboratory, and a Bible study group decided to form among the students in the laboratory, which is a fairly unusual thing to have happen in a research laboratory. And they decided to meet right next to my microscope. So I didn't actually have to read the Bible, but I would do my work. I'm a fly geneticist, so I'd be moving my little flies around, and I could hear the most interesting conversations and debates and introspection and arguments, methodical, systematic, detailed, and very open-minded discussions, which I thought was very inspiring. And then one day, my friend who started the Bible study group was working at the microscope near to me, and so we both had our eyes in the microscope working away, and I said, Layla, what brought you to study in this laboratory of genetics when you have so many questions about basic science principles and evolution? And it's not that she didn't believe in evolution, it's not that she did, she was able to debate it. And she said, well, I'm here studying genetics as a way of honoring God and appreciating everything that He put before us. It's the best way I can say my thanks. And that just moved me so much. I thought, why am I studying science? And I was studying science to understand, to figure out how things worked, and I thought, there's also plenty of room in science to appreciate the beauty of it without understanding exactly why that beauty is there. And so I think from that point on, I started to become much more open to how important it is to view science from many, many different ways. So I would say religion and faith has greatly enriched my ability to do science.
Capacity for awe, maybe, too.
Yes, yes.
I'd love you to answer this question, but I also have an addendum for you.
Okay.
Because this is an audience that I think will be interested in this question, and that's kind of what conflicts do you see within the Jewish community in terms of kind of science and religion? I mean, are they more accepting of science or religion, or so? Just talk to me about it.
Sure, I'll answer both of those in the same amount of time. So I grew up loving both science and Judaism. My father was the president of my synagogue when I was born. My mom was on the board, and I was always doing science experiments in my kitchen. I don't think I ever blew off my eyebrows, but I was definitely playing around a lot. And it wasn't until really I was in rabbinical school that I started to realize that a lot of the big questions that we grapple with have both scientific and Jewish ways to approach them. And the example that really struck me was the marshmallow experiment, which you may know about 4-year-olds and their ability to be able to control their impulses. And I happened to be reading that as I was in parallel reading a story from the Talmud about the Yetzer Hara, which is in Jewish tradition of the evil impulse, the piece that says, I want this right now. And I'm thinking, my God, the rabbis were talking about the Yetzer Hara, and that is exactly what Walter Mischel is talking about with the marshmallow experiment. And they're not talking about this in conflict. They're actually asking the question of, how do I act more ethically in this world? And came to recognize that the biggest questions that we face are not scientific and they're not religious, they're human. And one of the things that we've discovered through Sinai and Synapses, what's interesting is that in a lot of ways, the challenge in the evangelical world is how can we get evangelical Christians to accept science? That's sometimes a real challenge. In the Jewish world, the challenge is how can we get Jews to be excited about Judaism? Because Jews love science, and I was a pulpit rabbi for the first few years of my time, and it almost became a running joke that I would bring in some sort of study from the New York Times. And Rabbi Middleman talks about the study and this and that and the other. Anytime I was teaching, anytime I was preaching, they would resonate much more with the latest findings in genetics or ethics or plasma physics or whatever they were reading about in the more frequently the popular science press. That was a much clearer entry point than whatever the weekly Torah portion was.
Why do you think that is?
I think there are a few different reasons, and I'd also be curious to hear others. I think one reason is that in the Talmud, there is a lot of discussion of you don't take anything on faith. One of the classic stories in the Talmud is the story of the oven of Achnai, where two rabbis are arguing over some minute piece of law, and one rabbi has all these miracles to happen, and all the rabbis say, sorry, that's not proof. Sorry, and until eventually, the story says, God comes down and says, why are you arguing? This rabbi's always right. And all the other rabbis essentially say, God, quiet, you're not part of this discussion anymore. We've got to just use evidence here. And so I think that's really rooted in Judaism of show me the evidence, show me the argumentation. Don't let me take anything purely on faith. Let me ask what the questions are.
But I wanted to say that don't you think that that's in a certain sense a false dichotomy between faith and evidence? I mean,
yes.
Faith is often portrayed as believing things you know ain't true or believing things in the absence of evidence. But even in Judaism, certainly in Christianity too, which shares much of its tradition with Jews, evidence is present. But what's the evidence for God's action in the world that's offered in the Bible, for example, is by and large not scientific evidence, but it's historical evidence. And so it seems to me that this contradiction between evidence and faith is actually based on a background assumption that when we talk about evidence, we're really talking about scientific evidence. But actually, I think there's lots more different types of evidence than just scientific evidence, don't you?
Oh, sure, and I think there's a whole piece, Jonathan Haidt, who does a lot of work on moral psychology, I'm sure you know about this too, that we actually rarely use evidence as scientists. We use evidence as a lawyer would use it, to be able to say, show me what the argumentation is going to be. And I also think the word faith is problematic, because in Judaism, faith doesn't just mean acceptance of blind, here's what the truth says.
Nor in Christianity.
Nor in Christianity too, sure. But in Judaism, the word faith is really emunah, which means trust, of saying, I will be able to understand this, that there is at least some order here to be able to understand.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say, I think scientists have faith that the way they design their experiments, the way they ask their questions, even though they don't know what the answer is going to be, will lead them to an understanding. There's so much time in the laboratory. We're standing on the bench. What you see is not what you expect. You don't have reagents. You can't get the funding, or something just doesn't go well. But you have faith that if you keep persisting, you will actually push that boundary of understanding to a next level of maybe just a little less understanding. And so I think in that way there's a lot of similarity between faith, the scientists having faith that in the community.
So I think about what Jeff said a little differently. I have always wondered, why is it that Jews are so oversampled in medicine and science? Why have Jews that are less than 1% of the world's population, less than 0.5%, won 22% of all Nobel Prizes? Why are we so involved in those things? And I think there are two reasons. One is our incredible emphasis on education, and not just education in general, but a very specific kind of argumentation. So the Talmud has a methodology to it that requires very kind of deep analytical thinking about the nature of the evidence that you're talking about. And I think that was so deeply ingrained in Jewish ways of thinking that it has great application in science. And the second is, unlike Christianity, the emphasis in Judaism was never on belief, right? That was the purpose of my anecdote about Karl Reiner, but it's very clear in the Talmud that, you know, the issue, Judaism doesn't have a correlate to believe and you shall be saved, right? There's no idea like that in Judaism. Belief is not the key. Action in the world is the key. And so when you're very pragmatic, you believe in evidence, and you've got a deeply involved analytical, casuistic, we can get into that if you want, way of looking at the world, science is just an utterly natural kind of extension of that way of thinking.
I always thought it because you were smarter than most of us.
May I just add one quick comment? That question you posed is very interesting. I was thinking there may be two ways in which a community can be enriched. One is that people are drawn to it, and the other, I'm sure you'll agree, is that a wall has been built and some communities cannot enter for whatever reason, socioeconomic in particular, keep some communities unable to get to that point.
Let me ask you, one of the questions that was alluded to in the introduction, is science kind of playing God? Or in other words, what are the bioethical issues that you see? Because I understand that science and religion can be compatible, but you also hear a lot, at least, of conflict or fear or whatever. So what are the issues that you see where science and religion might conflict?
So, as someone who speaks a lot to the public about science and ethics, I'm not sure I've ever spoken to a public audience where I have not gotten the playing God question. So I just preempt it in my talks now. Human beings have been playing God since we crawled out of the trees, right? I mean, we have altered our environment in ways from the time we became sedentary farmers thousands of years ago. Today, from the moment you got out of bed till the moment you leave here and go to sleep tonight, you will not see a single thing that human beings did not create, not one. All of the trees you see are planted by landscapers. You're in buildings most of the time. If you look up at the sky, maybe the sun and the stars, that's it. Our atmosphere is completely altered chemically from the way it was. Our cloud patterns are altered by industry and jet streams. There is nothing natural left in the world for human beings. And even when we go out to find natural things, with rare exceptions, there are also natural things that are managed by human beings. And so we play God every moment of every day. There are only two questions about playing God. One, how good or bad are we at it? And two, when we express the power that we express by playing God, how careful are we? And so it's not playing God or not playing God. It's playing God well or playing God poorly. And part of the problem, and so the issue of modern science is not, are we going to start playing God? We're way past that. The issue is that science has become far more powerful. And because it's more powerful, because the capacity for harm is so much greater, the cautions and the inquiry and the introspection have to be so much greater. And that's why people ask the question.
Okay, I'd love to, but can we also talk about specific, well, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this theme. I think it's a very important theme, because I think there's another side of it I'd like to put forward, and that is this. Not only is science much more powerful, and therefore we are more able to affect our world and play God, if you like, but actually we've moved to a new place as a society and as individuals, where we put much more faith in science than ever before. And I refer to this as an approach which is scientism. We're putting science on a pedestal. And we've in fact reached the point where we think or act, and very often speak, as if science can decide the ethical questions that we have to decide about when we're playing well and when we're not playing well. Because whenever you say well, the question is, well, what do I mean by well? What is my definition of what is good? And that is something that I deeply believe science cannot decide. But we live in a society, in a culture, in which there is a very widespread view that science is really all the real knowledge there is. That is the belief in scientism. And that therefore we look to science for answers to those questions. I think that's a deep mistake. I think it's a dreadful intellectual error. I wrote a whole book called Monopolizing Knowledge, which is a repudiation of scientism. This is coming from someone who highly values science. Nevertheless, it's very important to see that side of the topic too. Don't you agree?
Totally agree.
But let me ask you, what are the conflict points? I mean, maybe we can talk about gene editing from whoever would like to speak to it. Tim, you're obviously very well versed in this area, but could you just talk to us about what may be ethical or conflicts you see?
Sure. So I've been a geneticist for a few decades, and this question about why we're doing what we're doing, and the consequences of it, and whether we are playing God has never been, there's been an uptick in that question. And I think it parallels our ability to change our genome. I think that may bring into the limelight the issue of how a person thinks their relationship is to God, and that God created man and women in his image. And so now we're changing that image. And I'm wondering if that is what is bringing this to a very heightened point. So, what are the science pieces? We can now, we as a community of scientists, can target very specifically regions in your genome. And it's perhaps mostly just self-moderation and law, just understood common law among scientists that we're not going to go in and alter humans yet, but we are really probably quite able to do that. And so it now is not an issue of can we, but should we, and it becomes a community conversation. I guess as a scientist, as this question comes up, should we play God? What I ask as a scientist and not a person of formal faith is, what do people of faith think God wants them to do with their life? And I would love to hear that answer. Do we have a responsibility to do some things? Do some people feel we have that responsibility? And is that responsibility something that we're now questioning because we're not sure whether God wants us to do that? I guess I'm just putting that question out as a scientist who does not know how communities of faith think about how they think about that topic.
And I want to bring in almost a biblical Jewish perspective in response to a lot of this, because you talk about being created in the image of God. And I'm thinking about the opening stories of Genesis. And actually there's two stories in Genesis, and there's two different elements of this. One is that in the first story of Genesis, in Genesis 1, God creates humanity in God's image. And in many ways, humans are designed to be creative as God is. If we are designed to be like God, we're almost commanded to be able to be creative in this kind of way.
That's exactly what I wonder about.
Yeah. And so that leads to the second creation story too, because in the second creation story, God places Adam in the Garden of Eden, and it's phrased that Adam is placed in the garden to work it and to tend it. And the Hebrew is l'oda'u l'shomra, to work it and to do things about it and to protect it. And there's a question of, what does Adam need to protect against? Because it's the Garden of Eden, it's paradise, it's perfect. What does he need to guard against anything? And one of my favorite interpretations of this is, what does Adam need to protect against? From the working it. that Adam needs to guard from overworking, from making sure that he is not going too far in the work that needs to be done. That's also an example of Shabbat, of being able to pull back and rest as well, which plays into the technological questions of where this can bump up against each other, and how 24/7 we tend to be.
But before we leave, and I'd love your all's, before we leave this issue of genes or gene editing and all of that, I mean, you could see that there would be a kind of ethical question whether we should whether, for example, people of wealth who might be able to afford gene editing, will their children be faster, smarter, live longer, be healthier, all of that? Are there ethical considerations that we're bumping up against? And I mean, I feel like there are. So maybe you could just talk to us about those, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe there aren't.
Well, those are two different questions, and speaking as someone who teaches ethics, they get conflated a lot, and that causes problems. So the question of whether we do something is a separate ethical conversation from the justice question. Who is going to have access to this thing once we decide we should do it? When people say we shouldn't do it because then only rich people will have it, they're conflating those two things. That's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason to do it in a way that has distributive justice, where you make sure that all people have access to it. So the question of should we manipulate our genome, there is no deeper theological question for human beings than the degree to which human beings should manipulate human beings, right? So as Jeff was saying, in Jewish view, human beings are co-creators with God of the world. In fact, we're bidden to try to help repair the world that God intentionally made incomplete. And then the question becomes, what does repair mean in that context? What kinds of technologies are appropriate because they pursue sort of a justifiable human goal? And that's why you see arguments about, yes, it's okay to use genetic engineering to repair genetic diseases, but it's not okay to use genetic engineering because I want my child to be 6'3" and have blue eyes. So you see that kind of dichotomy being argued out. And we could mention other kinds of continuums like that, what we call in my business the therapy enhancement continuum, and the degree to which we want to use our tools for therapy, that is correcting things that have gone awry, versus enhancement, that is designing human beings in ways that we think are aesthetically or otherwise desirable. The problem is that there's no clear line there. It's a continuum. There's a large gray area, and in that gray area is really where I think the difficult conversations happen.
So we are worried about disparity in access to genetic technologies. There is so much disparity already. We don't have to look at inequities with regard to genetic technologies. Those disparities are destroying communities and destroying our society. So yes, genetic technologies are here. Like so many other things, wealth is going to make those technologies more accessible to some communities and not others. Now there's an interesting twist to this, and this is what my group, the Personal Genetics Education Project, tries to do, is interestingly, because genetics has attracted so much attention and made people think about this core piece of themselves, that we're hoping that genetics itself will be something we make sure, as all communities, is not one of those things that falls under has the demise of being yet another thing for which there is disparity. And maybe, because we're so concerned about genetics, we will use that as one of those things that will break down this wall of disparity. And we're very excited about that. So,
Do you mind just telling everyone what you all do? Because you're kind of going into churches and African American communities, right?
yes, yeah. So actually I have two members with me, Marnie and Mohammed. This is an organization, actually it's an effort that started about 12 years ago in my laboratory. We started with Dana Waring, who is a social scientist. I asked her to try and keep my laboratory informed about the banter about genetics at that time when it was pretty clear we were going to this point we are today, and rapidly realized that that banter was among a very small group of people who are fairly educated and was bleeding out in a lot of communities. So we have over the 12 years and now very intensively are trying to make sure there's more equality of information and two-way dialogue to give people confidence that they can participate in this conversation. We don't actually promote genetic technology. We don't say don't use it. We don't say do use it. We just think everyone should be given an opportunity to be aware and to participate in the dialogue. And the response has been wonderful. We've been welcomed into many communities, and this is quite an honor to be sitting here to talk about genetics with the experts in faith.
Just a quick comment. So this, in 2015, we brought together about 150 genetic scientists, people from philosophy, religion, the humanities, law, brought them together in a global summit in Atlanta. We had an incredible faculty that included people like Steve Pinker and Margaret Atwood, and we wrote a paper that just came out this fall in Nature Biotechnology that are 10 principles to try to guide genetic technology moving forward. And a couple of them emphasize something that I think is often neglected in our thought about genetics. We always talk about access. Is there going to be equitable access? I'm a sociologist, and sociology of science and philosophy of science and history of science have taught us that all of science is based on value assumptions, usually unexamined. And so the question isn't just will people in other cultures have access to this. It is, are they going to be allowed to participate in the value conversations that underlie modern science? As genetics grows and as it impacts our world, which it will in profound ways, is it just going to be the Western countries that get to think deeply about the implications of this science, about the value basis upon which the science is applied, or are we going to include voices of cultures that are normally not part of the conversation? And amongst those 10 principles was a very strong statement of the importance of including global voices in the decision-making about the nature of genetic science and other sciences moving forward.
Maybe just before we leave this topic, because I think it's an interesting one, I mean, there have been debacles in the past, phrenology, you know, that where science has not been used to the best effect, shall we say. Can I just ask you, what are the lessons we've learned when you look back in the past and see some of the abuses of science in terms of kind of infringing on one's humanness or human rights? What are some of the lessons we've learned?
I think about the Tuskegee eugenics movement, the Better Baby movement, and people say often there weren't laws that were put in place. Laws were not enforced. We thought about this a lot at PG Ed, and we think the greatest abuse of all, this is the line of what you said, is not allowing a community to know about something. Because when someone knows about something, they will ask questions. And parents who know something or think there's a danger, there is nothing that will stop a parent from protecting their child. So knowledge, the greatest abuse of all, we think is knowledge. And that's why we think knowledge could possibly be the greatest protection, even more than legal actions.
Here, I, without disagreeing with that at all, it's not enough. And there are many examples of this. So when Freeman went around in his mobile lobotomy truck, performing orbital lobotomies, took about 15 minutes. He'd take a probe, he'd put it between the eye and the skull socket, and he would do a lobotomy with this needle in 15 minutes. Who was he doing it on? He was doing it very often on teenage girls and boys, and he was called in by the parents to do it. Boys because they fought, and girls because they were promiscuous in most cases. And the point is, why did that happen? If you look back at the history of genetics and you look back at the history of neuroscience, what you see is that people engaged in behaviors that we now think of as reprehensible on the basis of moral values that they applied to the science and then thought were scientific. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould writes about this in The Mismeasure of Man. it's really important to examine in a very, and we're very bad at this in our culture right now, by the way, in a very critical way, the value assumptions underlying our actions. And if we don't, we make mistakes over and over and over again, where years later, when the value assumptions have become a little bit more critically examined, we say, how could we possibly have thought about that? And I'll just end it by saying, imagine what would happen if we had the ability to genetically manipulate the genome in Victorian times, under the Nazis, in China under Mao, right? The values of that culture would say something like, well, maybe we could, under Mao, maybe we could manipulate the genome so that people would be more loyal to the state. Or under Victorian times, maybe we could delay menses in teenage girls and then they wouldn't get in trouble and then they could be, So, and they would have thought those were good things and parents would have agreed. So it's not, knowledge isn't enough. There has to be a deep examination of the values underlying knowledge, the value assumptions upon which we apply knowledge, or else we're going to make the same kinds of mistakes again.
And those values have to come from outside of science. They cannot be based on science. So many of the misuses that you're talking about are often promoted or were promoted on the basis of saying, this is the latest science, therefore you should get in line and do this.
And I jump in for 1 second, and I think that is also a danger that we have to think about in terms of religion also, because I think one thing that the question that I grapple with a lot is, what's the job something gets done? And what is the job that science is getting done? They're not doing a lobotomy just because he wants to do a lobotomy. He's doing it for a specific reason. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not. Why are we trying to understand the human genome? It's not always just let's have great knowledge, because knowledge is wonderful for its own sake. But a lot of the work is, okay, I want to do therapeutic enhancement. I want to be able to eliminate this disease. There are other undergirding questions. And it's also the same kind of question of religion, of why am I promoting this particular belief system? Why am I part of this community? Why am I advancing this particular worldview? Religion also is aiming to do something for who we are as a human being. And I think that's a big question, is that, how do we not go down the dangerous road of science? We also have to be careful not to go down the bad road of religion, because we're not being able to say, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
So thank you for bringing that up. We have a very, I think in this community, in this room right here, academics is a pretty big part of our lives. What we have found is that knowledge itself can create a sense of hierarchy when someone comes. This person has a PhD, this one didn't finish grammar school. Mm-hmm. It is very difficult for this person, must have tremendous confidence, to argue against this person. Mm-hmm. This person is not aware of what this person is saying. There is a tendency to believe. This is a real problem when a person goes to a physician and the physician says a lot of things and this person can't understand a few of the words. People have pride. They don't want to look dumb. And so knowledge for this person is not just the facts, but the confidence to ask a question and to doubt what someone says. So I agree. Now knowledge also, knowledge is always partial. We will always make mistakes. And the way we can not make so many mistakes is when someone says, what did you just say? Say that again? Tell me that again? And it's I suppose the confidence that comes from knowledge that can protect ourselves from going too far with something. And right now there's a disparity of knowledge and a huge disparity of confidence. And what's making up the difference is a lot of anger. We have to fix that.
One thing that you said strikes me, though, I've never heard it put this way. When you're talking about lobotomies, the end was not a scientific, science per se. The end was actually to enforce a moral code, right? So that's a case where the moral, in fact, science is kind of, or the human condition is actually hindered by the combination of both scientific progress
Right.
and a certain moral code from a certain age.
What people don't understand is that science is a social activity. It's embedded in a particular society at a particular time. It answers the questions that that society is asking at that time and is based on the underlying values of that society at that time. And science itself is based on values, that knowledge is good, that an empirical way is a way to solve things. But underlying that is, why do certain questions bubble to the top of science at any particular time? Why was it when I was in college and graduate school, 2% of the students were studying ecology and sustainability, and now it's 60% of the students at Emory say something about that in their essays. That happened overnight. You have these social changes that happen overnight, and they happen in the culture, homosexuality, and all of a sudden we have gay marriage, historically speaking, in a heartbeat. It happens in science too. And those aren't scientific processes. Those are social processes that affect science. And all social processes have values that underlie them. They're pursuing some set of goals that society is asking science to solve for them. And then science contributes its answers, which fertilizes society to ask further questions. And that dialogue between science and society is always going on. And it is infused with values throughout the entire process. So if you look back at the ideas about the brain, so when Freeman started his lobotomies, he was doing it on the right people. Moniz had won the Nobel Prize for discovering that lobotomies could stop epileptic seizures. And that was but you just saw the values of the society begin to seep into his science in an unquestioned way until by the end, he would get a call that, that a kid had been kicked out of school for fighting. He would go, he wouldn't examine the kid, he'd just do his 15-minute lobotomy and leave. And we can give many examples of those things. If you look at the neurological studies of homosexuality in the early 20th centuries, were based on all these assumptions that lesbians were more man-like and male homosexuals were more female-like physiologically. Now, if you look at the evidence now, it's not there, but they saw it. This is what Steve Gould said in The Mismeasure of Man, when they tried to understand intelligence, and they argued that in craniometry, that more intelligent people had bigger heads. Well, they would pour lentils, that's how they measured. They pour volume of lentils, and he said, and so if you were doing it on a white skull and you thought they were more intelligent, you'd hit the side, you'd let the lentils settle, you'd pour a little more in, you'd push them down, and then when you did it on a skull you thought was less intelligent, you wouldn't quite fill it all the way. He said, and these weren't intentional biases. These are unintentional biases.
Let's, with all of these advances in science, let me just ask you, what's kind of the point of religion? And I say that only partly tongue-in-cheek. I mean, what is the role of religion in a society where the fastest growing religion are the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, people who have no particular religious faith? They may be spiritual but not religious. So in that society, and in a society where technology is advancing so quickly, is God being squeezed out? What is the purpose or the role of religion? Actually, can I start with you?
Sure. What's been interesting, particularly in relationship to science, is the most common way that a lot of Jews think about science and religion is Gould's non-overlapping magisteria of science and religion. Science deals with the how and religion deals with the why. But that's not exactly true, because what has often happened is that science has seeped into what religion's purview had been. So for a long time, religion was the source of truth. That's how we knew truth, and now science has taken that over. Then they said, okay, religion is all about ethics. All right, religion's not about truth anymore, religion is about ethics. Well, do you know people who are religious but not ethical? You know people who are ethical but not religious? Right? Okay, they're not exactly the same thing, QED. So it's now this question, some people think that religion is having to play defense because science keeps pushing out what science had been. And I don't think of it as religion playing defense, I think of it as religion evolving. Religion is trying to be able to say, what does it need to be doing right now at this moment? I think my answer for it right now is not going to be the same if you were to ask me 300 years from now. Religion's job may be very different. For right now, I think that the job that religion works for in 2018 is really twofold. One is it allows us to be able to have a specific language to talk about our worldview. So we use language to communicate. Everyone speaks some sort of language, but nobody speaks language. We speak English or Arabic or Hebrew or French. You need the specific language to be able to talk about that. Religion can be a common way to share and talk about the specific language for the general kinds of questions. And the other thing that it really allows us to be able to do is strengthen community bonds. We use technology and FaceTime, and I talked to my kids just now, and it was wonderful to be able to talk with them, and thank God for that. But you're not Skyping in here. Some of you may be Skyping in, and some of you may see this live, but those of you who are here in the room, you wanted to be able to be here physically to be part of this in real life. And that's always going to be something that we're going to be looking for. And so I think religion facilitates the social bonds and connections and an ability to be able to really be present with each other in a way that we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years.
I was thinking about the God of the gaps, that whole argument.
Well, I want to address your original question because I agree with what Jeff just said. I think religion does serve that purpose. But I think it's the wrong question. I mean, I think the very asking of the question, what job does religion do, bypasses what Christians, I think religion is about, okay? I mean, either there is a God or there isn't a God. If there is a God, then the question is not what job does religion do, but how much that religion reveals of a reality, okay? And so I think from my own perspective, the question is biasing towards what I would think of as being a utilitarian view, which I would repudiate. I don't think utilitarianism, the idea that you can draw value out of utility, works as a philosophy or as an attitude to life. Of course, we must use things and we must have attitudes that are functional and achieve their objectives. But how you decide what the objective should be has, in my view, if it's going to have any deep, serious religious or other ethical significance, to be based on some level of transcendence. And so from my perspective, I would say the answer to your question, if it excludes transcendence, okay, leaves me in a place which comes short of what I would think of as being certainly a Christian view of the world, and I would have thought of a Jewish view, okay, at least a religious Jewish view, okay.
Let me ask you, I mean, are you concerned that that the God of the gaps is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we answer more and more of the
Okay, God of the gaps. So I hope everyone understands what the God of the gaps is about. The God of the gaps is the God that lives in the places that we don't understand about our world, and as science progresses, the God of the gaps therefore gets narrower and smaller, and the perspective, the viewpoint is that eventually the God of the gaps will vanish, okay? And we'll be left in a purely secular understanding of the world. That view is a view which is contrary certainly to the Christian, and I'll let the Jewish people speak to the Jewish viewpoint. That view is contrary to the historic view that Christians have taken about the relationship between science and religion, and science and God. It is a very popular dichotomy that gained a great deal of traction in the 20th century, that either God did it or there's a natural explanation. But that dichotomy is not true to the Bible, whether you're talking about the Old Testament or the New, and it was never the perspective of people of religious beliefs and religious practices over history. It was never the case that if there was a natural explanation, then God didn't do it. God was seen as being active in all of what goes on in the world around us. And that, in my view, if you take that view, then there's no such thing as God being squeezed out.
Well, and I think one thing that I want to push back on a little bit, and this may be a difference of the Jewish and the Christian views on this, that it's something that Paul mentioned as well, is that Judaism has not had at its core a emphasis that much on belief. It's been much more on action. And I'm thinking about the different ways in which Judaism and Christianity talk about God. That in Christianity, and I'm not a Christian, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that a large part of the Christian faith and the view of God is Jesus Christ as both a person and as divine, and that is part of what God is. In the Jewish world, and going back to the Hebrew phraseology, when God reveals God's self to Moses, God says the name is Eyeh Asher Eyeh in Hebrew, which literally means something like, I will be what I will be. Some people say, I am that I am, but it's probably more accurately, I will be what I will be. It's a much more fluid, dynamic understanding of God. And I took a friend of mine who was a Franciscan monk to a Shabbat service, which was just a wonderful experience to have him in his robe. And we went to this beautiful musical service, and we walked out and I said, what did you think? He said, I found it incredibly beautiful. He said, I struggled with where I found God there. I said, how so? He said, I felt like God was just out of reach. Just out of reach. And to me, it felt very natural because that's how I view God, as something that is something to pursue, something that I experience and process, whereas for him, his view of God was very concrete.
So I was debating whether to say this or not. I mean, I think most people have a very pedestrian view of God. God, there are over 200 billion stars in our galaxy. There are over 400 billion galaxies. Okay? Think about that for a second. God created all of them. A being that can do that is much further beyond our ken than we are to an insect, right? And yet we start talking about what God is and what God is to me, and God did this, and God, we don't have a clue what God is, what God has done, the nature of God. We have to translate this. One of the Hebrew words for God is Ein Sof, which can be translated literally as having no end, but really means just something so far beyond our ability to comprehend that we can only get the tiniest glimpses of what that thing is. So if there is some animating spirit of the universe, if there is God as creator, or even if there isn't God as creator, but God is some sort of force within you, we don't have a clue what it is. Not a clue. And the tiny little hints that we might get from Scripture, from our wisest minds, are still an ant trying to understand the Mona Lisa, right? And so, I get a little bit impatient with this kind of discussion about God because it's so, used philosophically, it's so underdetermined that it makes it really, that we end up saying pedestrian things about God because we don't know how to say realistic things about God. And that's why I very much appreciate Jeff's point, that God is something you pursue. God is something so far beyond us that we can't ever grasp God. We can't ever say God is here. We can only try to approximate those kinds of things that we imagine are the directions God wants us to go.
So I'm a scientist, and I just want to say that you were asking how religion was. Just being here and listening to this conversation has greatly enriched my thinking about my responsibilities, why I'm here, where I should go. So I can't put a concrete name to it, but I think the presence of faith, communities of faith and religion, enriches us in ways that science needs. So thank you.
And we're not wrapped up yet, so. Because I have a couple of other questions that I really would love to ask. Now, we had a little bit of a debate on the conference call ahead of time about the word evidence. So I'm not quite sure what other word to use. So let me just throw out the question in the spirit of, humility, that I may not be asking the question correctly, exactly. But what I'm wondering is, Does science offer any evidence or any clue or any hints that there's more than this material existence that we live right now? Is there, I think maybe about the notion of consciousness, and can our consciousness operate when our brains are not working right, or you hear about those near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences? So let me just ask you, do you think there's any evidence that science brings to the table that there may be more than this human existence?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that one. Paul said a moment ago, we don't have a clue about God. Actually, I think we do have some clues, okay? I think we have some historical clues, and I would have thought that Jewish people think that there are historical clues about God. But I think there are scientific clues as well. These are coming in a variety of different types, but one of them was referred to by Albert Einstein, who said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And that was an allusion to the fact that it is remarkable in how much depth and detail and with what great power we can understand how the universe works on the basis of what goes on between my ears. I think people who believe there is a personal God, an intelligent God, are people who have at least perhaps a reasonable explanation for why it is, why it's perhaps not as surprising as one might otherwise have thought. And that comes back to this question of what the image of God is. Obviously, historically, part of what we've thought of as being the image of God is something to do with intelligence and so forth. But that's one example.
In fact, can I just ask you to explain a little bit more? I mean, Martin Rees, scientist in Britain, talks about, I think it's 6 numbers, but it's this notion that it's almost the anthropic principle, that there's this notion that the universe is so calibrated it had to be calibrated by some intelligence.
So that's another of the hints or clues that if you look at science, if you look at physics, there are a number of parameters. The exact number is ill-defined, but as you say, Rees picks out 6. That we know if these numbers, these parameters of the laws of nature, were a tiny bit different, then the universe would be totally different. We wouldn't have carbon, and we wouldn't have life as we know it. And so there does appear to be a sense in which the universe is fine-tuned. This is the expression that is usually used. Fine-tuning is fine-tuned for the existence of people like us. Maybe that's kind of self-centered, and one of the arguments for why that happens is actually to do with centering on what people are, and that's called the anthropic principles. Not time for me to unpack it. Right. But you've either got to think that it's an accident or a design, or just that we're on one of billions or trillions of different universes, and we just happen to be the ones who are here.
So a couple things. First of all, when I speak, I don't speak for Judaism, so I just speak for myself. Unless I
Sorry,
I'm just saying,
I didn't mean to tease you.
I wasn't trying to represent Judaism, and no Jew would want me to. But but I said that we don't have a clue as to the nature of God, and your response were to give us clues that there is a God. Okay. And there's a difference between clues that there is some greater power and the nature of that power. So think about this for a second. You'll see this is an analog analogy to the 400 billion galaxies. The single most complex thing we know about in the universe is the human brain. Billions of cells with trillions upon trillions of connections. We don't have it, except for the brain of a monkey and going down. There's nothing even close to that complexity that we've ever discovered anywhere, including the entire rest of our planet. Yet there are things about our brain we can't understand, like consciousness. People have tried to create theories of consciousness forever. There are some new ones, and everyone thinks they've got it, and nobody really has a clue what consciousness is. It is possible that no intelligent mechanism like the brain can ever have the capacity to understand itself. That is, it can only understand something at a lower level of aggregation, which means that we'll never understand consciousness. I mean, I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is a possibility. We'll never understand consciousness because the brain itself does not have the power to understand itself. Maybe someday we'll create computers that are more complex than the brain, and they'll understand the human brain, but they won't be able to explain it to us because we're not smart enough to understand any more than we can explain to a dog what a dog is, right? Now, if that's true, what we're talking about is the absolute capacity of the brain to understand. And if we're talking about a God that so far exceeds us that it can create 400 billion galaxies, each of which have hundreds of billions of stars, and life on Earth and all of those things, we have to really be extraordinarily humble here and understand the limitations of our knowledge about these things. Now, the other side of that is, as human beings, we always want to understand, and we should always strive, and we should push our brains to the limit of their capacity. It just, we need to do what the Talmud does. When the rabbis are having an argument and they can't come to a conclusion, they go take it. That's it. We don't know. We'll never know. When the Messiah comes, God will let us know. But this is as far as we can take it. And I think sometimes we need that humility around discussions of God as well.
And I want to play off of this. I'm going to actually flip the question a little bit, because a couple of years ago, there was an evangelical Christian named Eric Metaxas who wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal that got a lot of play called "Science Increasingly Makes the Case for God." And I read it and my head almost exploded. So I wrote a response piece on the Huffington Post entitled, "Sorry, science doesn't make a case for God, but that's okay." And what was wonderful was actually later that week, I got attacked by both the intelligent design community and Jerry Coyne, who was actually even farther to the left than Richard Dawkins. So I was like, I'm doing something right if they're both attacking me here. But the piece of you know, with the 6 numbers and the fine tuning and all those different pieces, that my fear of basing my faith on the science is that science at its core is designed to disprove.
Right.
Science at its core is designed to be able to say, we're going to become progressively less wrong. So if we discover that whatever the parameter, no, it's actually, that number is not important anymore, is that, well, now it's 5 numbers. Oh, now is your faith going to change? What if the numbers are different orders of magnitude? What if some other information comes up? I am not willing to base my faith purely on the science, because the science may change. Now that might mean that my faith or my view or my language of God is going to have to adapt or change. There was a piece that I wrote for Nautilus about what will we discover if the multiverse is true, right? Because who knows if that's going to happen? It may, but if it is, what's Judaism's response going to be? All the liturgy, all the language is going to change. Turns out, I think that we actually do have some language that we can talk about this in this kind of way. So I think that it almost comes back to the scientism piece of that if you're basing your religion on science, it's
vulnerable.
I completely agree with you, but I was answering a direct question. Are there clues? Are there hints in science? And I think, yes, there are, but I agree with you completely that it would make no sense for me as someone who repudiates scientism to say that my faith is, or my Christian belief is, and tradition is based on science. It's not.
Right.
Thank you.
I think we're coming close to the end where we can now accept questions, but let me just throw one more out. And that is basically, can you all, and this lends itself to a little bit of personal anecdotes, is there something that you feel science can't explain?
I think science currently can't explain a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
An awful lot.
It currently can't explain a lot, and it intrinsically can't explain a lot, okay? I mean, if you think about all kinds of topics like history or philosophy or, for that matter, sociology, politics, economics, these are things which science, by which I mean natural science, I'll excuse myself from saying that I don't think political science is actually science in the sense that I mean it, okay? But science in the sense of natural science cannot explain any of those things that I just listed. And so vast quantities of our life are things that science cannot intrinsically explain because they are not susceptible to the approaches that science takes, natural sciences take.
Maybe I'll add that one of the duties of science is to keep asking questions to let us know what we don't know. So it's part of science is making sure we don't stop probing, or making sure that part of the job of science is to keep asking about things we don't understand. So that's why.
Well, that's true, but that's also the job of philosophy. It's also the job of art critiques. I mean, so that is not something that's unique to science, I think.
No, not at all.
As someone who studies neuroscience, one of my areas is the ethics of neuroscience. There's all kinds of things neuroscience will never be able to understand, in my view. So our qualia, which is the word they use for our subjective experience, so how I see blue. We'll never know if how I see blue is the same way that you see blue. But even take something like love. There's been a lot of work on the brain to show what parts of the brain activate when we're feeling love, what neurotransmitters are being squirted into our brain. When you add all of that up, it is not an explanation of the sensation of love and how love moves us to do things. It is an explanation of the mechanisms by which, to some degree, love might be generated, or that is the sort of physical stratum that expresses. But does it tell us something about the experience of love and the motivation of love? I don't think so, and I don't think it ever will be able to.
And I also think a mystical experience falls into that as well. I mean, they've put nuns and Buddhist monks into the brain scanner and seen what's happened when they're having this kind of communion with the other or a spiritual experience. It's very predictable. It's similar brain activity, actually. But does that mean that they are not really experiencing a connection with something else?
William James said that mystical experience itself is ineffable, right? It's not something that we can describe. And if you can't describe it in words, if it's ineffable, then it can't be described in scientific language either, because the quality itself is ineffable.
As much as I really hate to cut this off, and keep it concise so we can get as many questions as possible in.
My question is, why do you think it is that for my fellow scientists, it's so much harder to accept ideas of God or religion than love and beauty and other ineffable things like that?
I don't think it's got anything to do with us being scientists. Okay, I think the statistics, the sociological data show that science does not tend to lead people away from religious faith. If you survey university faculty, you find that people in the non-science disciplines are just as likely to be secular skeptics as people in the science disciplines. And in fact, in many surveys, scientists and engineers are more likely to be religious. So.
Thank you. It strikes me that one topic that has not come up is really one of the key sources of tension within different religious communities that define what Jews who are less threatened by science and perhaps more threatened, and similarly within Christianity, which is the view of Scripture as literal versus something more symbolic. Because if taking a literal view of Scripture naturally leads to tensions with scientific evidence. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and whether that's a bridgeable gap, whether that's not a bridgeable gap, and how that influences your thinking.
So I think it comes back to questions of authority. I tend to say, spoiler alert, Genesis is not a science textbook. That's, sorry. But there, in my mind, Genesis and a lot of the Bible, but particularly the opening chapters of Genesis, were the best understanding they had at the time to understand who we were and where we're coming from. And the issue now is, what's the level of authority where these texts have come in, and how are they communicated? And I think that starting with an assumption that they are literally true, that's where a lot of the problem becomes. But it also says, as Ken Ham says, who runs the Creation Museum, that our start is the Word of God. We're gonna fit this all. We're gonna fit all the square pegs into round holes, rather than, I think, in my mind, if you're going to try to understand the world, you've got to be able to understand, what is the universe telling us? What's the science saying right now?
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, obviously Christians have a view of the Bible that varies between their different communities, and so it varies all the way between people who take a very literalistic view, right the way to people who take an analogical, complete view. I mean, my sense is that there are probably more people who take a literalistic view amongst Christians than there are amongst Jewish people. But I assume there are people who take literalistic views amongst Jews. Is that true?
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, Genesis is a poem. It's not a textbook. Brad Artson, who's the dean of the rabbinical school at Ziegler, his prayer book is all written, none of it's written in prose like most prayer books, it's all written in poetry form. Because he argues that all of these texts were originally poetry. And if we would never think of taking poetry literally. Poetry is by its very nature metaphorical and allegorical. And that is the nature of the textbook. The second thing to say is there is no such thing as a fundamentalist Jew. Because the term fundamentalism refers to taking the text and only the text as the final word of God. Judaism doesn't do that. We have the Gemara, we have the Talmud, we have tons of explanation and exegesis and descriptions and flights of fancy. I mean, if you've never read the Talmud, you have no idea how far these rabbis go in flights of fancies. I mean, there's a whole long description of, well, if we're made in the image of God, does that mean God has a body? And if God had a body, what would it look like? Does God have a penis? And I mean, you have no idea. And all of that is part of trying to enrich the text, understand the text, find meaning in the text, and that, by definition, is not fundamentalist. And therefore, there really, actually, technically, is no such thing as fundamentalist Judaism. Hasidim are not fundamentalists, because in the sense that Christian fundamentalists are fundamentalists, because all text is mediated in Judaism. And if it's mediated, you're not a fundamentalist.
And while you're getting the microphone, if I can just say something here, having been religion correspondent, what's pretty clear is that one reason a lot of people think that Christians have this kind of literal view of the Bible is because the ones who do seem to be loudest, right? And I think often those who don't, they're just not talking about the fact that they, believe in evolution and in the inspired word of the Bible, as opposed to the literal word of the Bible. So I think there's kind of a cartoonish view of how Christians view science as the enemy. I think it's a relatively small, not terribly small, but a relatively small group of people. But even for the people who aren't literalists, Christians who aren't literalists, I would say that Christians also see points of tension, or do see points of tension. For example, there's a tension, I think, among neuroscientists who would say that, like Francis Crick, that all we are is, brain activity and brain function. That is who our identities are. And I think a lot of Christians and probably a lot of Jews and others would say, hey, that, I'm not sure I agree with that. So that could be a point of tension where you don't believe that the Bible is the literal word of God, but is actually an inspired word. So I think there's tension, more tension for fundamentalists, but there's still tension, enough tension to go around. That's my view.
Oh, hi. To me, a very important part of all this is human behavior. And a lot of that is contained in the Torah. Science has changed our relationship to that. We don't just take that to faith, we question, and now it's kind of like a story. It's an allegory. It contains a lot of things that, interestingly, we all kind of follow. We're dressed, we don't kill, we have boundaries here. But since our relationship is weakened with this, God is, it's not just simplistically confined to that. How do we preserve, humanity involves how we behave, how we have relationships with each other. And science changes our relationship to the Torah, and a lot of our behavior is contained in that. So how do we go from here onward?
So I want to share some of work from a friend of mine who's at Northeastern University, named David Costello, who's done a lot of work on the science of compassion. And because in many ways, what could be more Jewish and religious than compassion, caring for the others? And he has actually distilled a lot of work on compassion, of what engenders compassion in other people. And we can use texts and stories from the Bible to be able to talk about human compassion here. And what Costello has discovered in some of the science is the way to be able to build compassion in other people is building a point of connection. So one thing that I would not say to all of you here is that I am a diehard Yankees fan. That's something I probably should not have said just now, because now we all going to lynch me when I come out. But if I were to say, but we're all people that I lived in Boston for a year, and I spent a lot of time here in Newton. Now all of a sudden there's a level of connection here. So how can we use some of the science of, again, the first question of one of the biggest human questions that we face, how can we find texts from remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and using the Torah as a way to engage in those kinds of questions, and use the science of compassion to be able to help us engage who we are. And we can use that in any different ways of thinking about types of human behavior.
Hey, hi, thanks for this great conversation. I'd just like to ask if anybody or maybe everybody on the panel would speak to what I see as one of the major points of tension between science and at least a lot of forms of religion, which is that science has a narrative that things are going to keep changing. We're going, as a sociological institution, as an institution, science tells the story that we are going to advance, that we are going to change, our circumstances are going to change, our relationships to each other are going to change. I worship in a liturgical Christian tradition. We've been telling the same story for 2,000 years. That story is not going to change. We're telling one story. And so there's a little bit of an Ecclesiastes sort of, there's nothing new under the sun for, I think, a lot of religious traditions. Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, right? That the human situation is just the way it is. And for science, the story is different. And I'd just like to see if anybody would speak to that.
So the Dalai Lama said that if science disproves anything that Buddhism believes, Buddhism should cease to believe it. So Buddhism does not necessarily have that. You know, Judaism today is very, very different than Judaism was 500 years ago, which was very different than Judaism was 500 years before that. Religion evolves too. Just because we use the same narratives, learn things from it. Look at the way in which both Christianity and Judaism thought about women and women's roles and how they think about them today, how they thought about homosexuality and how they think about it today in many cases. So I don't buy the argument that religion doesn't change and evolve. Just because we see certain texts, certain stories, certain ways of looking at the world as being endless fonts of change and progress, which is how I see religion, doesn't mean that that religion doesn't change. So I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question.
History is vital for our understanding of the world. And if we just totally ignore history, which is, of course, events of the past that we think don't change now, then we've missed a great deal. Of course, science is progressive. I agree with Paul. There are many ways in which religion is progressive. But religion also embeds into it an understanding of history, an interpretation of history, and unique events of the past are part of religious understandings of the world. And in that sense, there is a sense in which religion is more solidly founded on past events that don't change. And so Christians say Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever, because we think that Jesus Christ was a unique revelation in the person of God. But Jews say, that when Moses encountered the burning bush and encountered God, as Jeff cited earlier today, that was a unique event of the past and has eternal significance in some sense. So I think there's a balance here between and needs to be in religion, between progression, which is very much a part of what goes on, but also grounding in history.
And I would say, I'm going to play off of that, and thank you, that what we live in this world is a dynamic tension that I would say between innovation and tradition, and liberalism and conservatism. in not necessarily the political sense, but being able to say, I want to be moving forward and take risks, and I also need to be having a place of safety. And we need both of those things. That's very rooted in our evolutionary history. That we can't just be sitting in our houses all the time because nothing ever happens, but we can't just be out in the world and trying everything because there's way too much risk. So how do we balance the risk-reward, the innovation and the tradition, and the historical elements and the progressive elements as well?
Unfortunately, we're out of time for this evening, but I want to thank our panel and our moderator one more time for that great conversation.